Well, we took a look at some of the layers in Jerusalem in the last presentation. Now we're going to take a look at some of the complexities of modern Jerusalem. We're shifting completely into the 20th century right now, and I want to talk about Jerusalem that was once divided and has now been reunited as a city. And this is the presentation that's going to deal a little bit more with the conflict, and it's a little bit more complicated. And I want to say straight out, I practiced a couple of times to see how I could fit all of this into 45 minutes. Not so simple. So I'm going to try to be, first of all, I'm going to try to be on time. Second of all, by nature of me trying to stick to the time, I need to just say straight out, there are going to be things that I'm not going to talk about. Things that are not going to be said. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. That doesn't mean that there aren't other perspectives or other opinions. I hope that you will look at this as a starting point for conversation and for learning, and not the end point, because this is a subject that I'm still studying. I'm constantly studying, and as my colleague and I always say to the groups we meet with, we've been dealing with this. I've been dealing with this subject for about 8 years now. I have a colleague who's been dealing with it for 15. Every time we think we've hit the bottom of the material, we discover that there's another 3 layers underneath it. So keep that in mind, but what I want to do right now is to give you, more than anything, the background and the history of how we ended up with a Western Jerusalem and an Eastern Jerusalem today. Today, if you hear about Jerusalem in the news, oftentimes you're hearing talk about violence or incidents that are happening in Eastern Jerusalem with the Eastern Jerusalem Arab residents / Palestinians, depending on how they identify. And I have a feeling that most people, we hear about it, we don't necessarily understand how exactly that got to be, how complicated this situation actually is. So I want to take us back, not thousands of years, but I want to take us back to 1948. Specifically, I want to take you back to May 14th, 1948, not in Jerusalem, but in Tel Aviv, where that lovely short man with the funny haircuts and the funny voice, I get to say it because I love David Ben-Gurion so much, only out of respect. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, declares Israel's independence. And it's a moment for celebration, but it's also a moment to prepare for the inevitable. Already since November 29th, 1947, there's been a civil war that's been raging throughout the country between the Jewish residents of Palestine and the Arab residents of Palestine. Jerusalem already at the center of this, because everyone understands that Jerusalem is critical, both strategically, because you have a large Jewish population, you had a Jewish majority at the time, and as David Ben-Gurion would say, you can have a Jerusalem without a state. You can't really have a state without Jerusalem. From a perspective of morale, right? This is the symbol of the Jewish people. If Jerusalem falls, it crushes the spirit. After David Ben-Gurion announces Israel's independence, declares Israel's independence, though we know that what happens next, celebrating, Shabbat comes in, because it's on Shabbat Eve, and war breaks out. The next day, armies from the 5 neighboring Arab countries are going to attack the newly born state of Israel. In the north, Syria and Lebanon. In the south, you have Egypt. You have the Iraqis kind of sending forces over. And then to the east, you have the Jordanians. The Jordanians, though, they actually weren't really waiting for a declaration of independence. They're already on the ground because they had a relationship with the British. The British trained their legion, trained their army. They used them kind of as policemen. And so the Jordanians already started creeping towards Jerusalem to try to lay claim to the old city. They're the strongest army in the region at the time, and they outnumber the Jewish forces. They're not quite yet the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, because the state was just born. They're kind of like a lot of different groups of militias who are fighting together. You had about 200 of the now Israeli soldiers versus 1,000 of the Jordanian soldiers in the battle for the Jewish quarter. And what we're looking at over here is the commander of the Jewish forces, Moshe Rusnak, signing off on the surrender of the Jewish quarter on May 28th, 1948. So think about that. 2 weeks after Israel's declaration of independence, the residents of the Jewish quarter can't hold on anymore. They were left with about 30 soldiers. It got to a point where even a 10-year-old boy had to join in the fighting. He was killed running messages back and forth from station to station. That was the situation. The Jordanians have a resounding victory on the old city of Jerusalem within 2 weeks, and they've also taken the surrounding 5 square kilometers around the old city. This is the scene, May 28th, 1948. In the Jewish quarter, you have the Jordanian legionnaire overseeing the women and children who are leaving to what will become known as Western Jerusalem, which is under Israeli control. Israel managed to hold on to the western side of Jerusalem. The reason, by the way, you don't see men there is because when Abdallah Attal, who we're going to meet in a minute, the Jordanian general, saw how few soldiers were left, he was incredibly embarrassed. They say that he said, if I had known you were so few, I would have sent my men to fight you in the streets with sticks, right? Not with weapons. We could have gone and just, we could have done this physically, face to face, because you were 30, and he needed to take extra soldiers, quote unquote, to save face when he went to Jordan. So he took 260 men with him as prisoners of war, even though they weren't soldiers. In November of 1948, that same Abdallah Attal over here, the Jordanian general, and this is, everyone recognizes him, right? Moshe Dayan, the famous eye patch, the Israeli general. They meet in an abandoned house that kind of sat almost on the border between east and west in a neighborhood called Musrara. And they've come to do something important. So again, Abdallah Attal, Moshe Dayan, I don't know who this guy is. I think he feels a little silly that he had his fingers in his mouth during this historic picture. Every time I see it, it's like, oh man, note to self. If I'm ever on the verge of something that could possibly be historic, hands behind my back. But that's a different point. What are they doing in this picture? We're seeing them on the ground of this house. Here's Attal, Moshe Dayan. You can see Moshe Dayan is not very happy in these pictures, right? This is not, he doesn't have the upper hand in Jerusalem. And the two of them are sitting here and they're sketching on a map the armistice line, the ceasefire line of Jerusalem. Now, I'm going to stress it's an armistice line, so it's not a border. It's a line that says, my men are here and your men are here, which might give us somewhat of an understanding as to why these two gentlemen didn't take this quite as seriously, I'm saying this in hindsight, didn't take it quite as seriously as we might imagine that they would. And what I mean by that is, at least according to, there's a couple versions of how this goes. Let's go with the one that puts the blame on both sides. They show up, they pull the map out, and it hasn't been marked. They pull out 2 wax pencils, one in red, one in green, and they start tracing their lines. This is the map that we end up with, right? This is, when I talk about West Jerusalem, that's this area over here. It's going to be about 38 square kilometers. All of this within the red line, that is going to be under Israeli control, because that's where the armistice was signed. That's where the forces were at the time of the armistice signing. This area here beyond the green line, that's the 6 square kilometers of eastern Jerusalem that will end up being under Jordanian control, including this area, this 1 square kilometer of the old city. Here's the Temple Mount right over here. That's what we're looking at. And they kind of sketch out these lines, and they don't give much thought to the future because they're army generals. They say, in the future, there's going to be some sort of agreement, or at least Moshe Dayan is thinking, in the future, my leadership, the leadership of the state of Israel, is going to set boundaries with the Jordanians, and we'll have a properly drawn map. The theory is that Abdallah Attal was probably saying, I'm not going to take this too seriously because maybe I'll have a chance to finish the job, or maybe if you want to give him the benefit of the doubt, he's saying the same thing that Dayan was. I don't think that was what he was thinking, but in either way, they draw this map that's not accurate. And what they don't know is that there's never going to be another more accurate map that's drawn up. There's not going to be peace with the Jordanians until the 1990s. And you end up with a map where if it looks like this while you're zoomed out, it's a map that's 1 to 20,000 in terms of the ratio. So when you zoom in, look at those lines drawn with wax pencil. They're thick. They're not accurate. And not only that, I don't know if you know this about Israel, we're a little bit warmer than Norway. Right? It's a little bit hotter in Israel than it is in Norway, and when you have wax markings on a map, they sweat, right? They start expanding. And you end up in a situation where, look, You've got houses that are covered by these lines. Not even the full house, right? Where do these buildings now go? Right? Are they in Jordan? Are they under Israeli control? Do we need to judge the line by the middle of this stretched wax pencil line? It's not an accurate map, and that's going to create a lot of problems, as we'll see in the future. But this becomes the reality. Jerusalem becomes divided between East Jerusalem under Jordanian control, what we can see over here, West Jerusalem under Israeli control, and there are areas of no man's land in between as well, filled with barbed wire and not very nice looking. Particularly, anyone been to the Mamilla Mall? Yeah. Raise your hand if you've walked around Mamilla. You got yourselves an aroma coffee? Yeah, some of you know what I'm talking about. You know it's good, right? So this is Mamilla Mall today, as of a couple weeks ago. It's a beautiful boulevard filled with boutique stores. All of the, the big brands are located here in Mamilla. Wonderful place to get coffee. Right over here, that stairway leads you to Jaffa Gate. This is Mamilla Mall in the 1950s. In between, as Jordan is ruling over East Jerusalem, you're going to have a situation, you're going to have three main issues. The first issue I want to talk about is the serious one, security. Look over here. This is the area of Jaffa Gate, right over here. You see the old city walls. You have to imagine that there were Jordanian legionnaires, Jordanian soldiers all along those walls protecting the Jordanian interests. And there's supposed to be a ceasefire, and technically there is, but every week there's always one crazy soldier. It wasn't official. There was one soldier, always one soldier, a different soldier each week, who took the law into his own hands and would shoot into West Jerusalem. Called it the rotating Majnun, the rotating crazy one. It was consistent. At a certain point, Israel, to protect its citizens in Western Jerusalem, look at what they build over here. An ugly concrete wall to prevent the sniper fire from reaching the residents of Mamilla. Imagine beautiful Mamilla, nobody wanted to live there. It was the slums of Jerusalem. It was a frontier neighborhood under Jordanian sniper fire. Now look at it. Whew. But we walk around there today, you actually still see, as beautiful as it is, you can still see the scar where the anti-sniper fire wall would have gone from side to side, in between American Eagle and another, big brand name. The scar is still there. So the first issue is security. You're living in a divided city. Now you have, the Jordanians who are on the wall with good vantage and good firing range onto the Israelis in Western Jerusalem. The second thing, though, is holy sites. Because, remember, the Jewish quarter falls in 1948. For 19 years, no Jew is going to be allowed not into the Jewish quarter, not to the Western Wall, definitely not to the Temple Mount, as we established before. Even though there were agreements for religious access, it never happened. And so the Jews of Jerusalem found themselves in a predicament. Here we are, we're in our own country, in this land. Meters away from us are our holy sites, the Western Wall and the Temple Mount. We can't access them. So what do? They go to a site called Mount Zion. Mount Zion has a compound in it called the King David's Tomb compound. On the bottom floor, you have what's believed by many to be the burial place of King David. Above that is the traditional site of the Last Supper that Jesus ate right before he was betrayed. And on top of that, the Jews of 1948 till 1967 Jerusalem got creative. And whenever they would have a child who was about to celebrate their bar bat mitzvah and they wanted to take them on a roots trip, they would walk them up to this roof over here. Let's take a look. So you're walking. Now on top, we're going to walk up these stairs and be standing on top of the room of the Last Supper, the upper room. To the left, what you see, that this room over here with the blue sign was actually a special room for the President of Israel, so that he would have special access to this site. And you have to watch very carefully. This is the view that they had from 48 till 67. You walk over here and you peer between the trees. It was not easy to get this shot, so hold on one second. You peer between the trees. We're going to zoom in 1 minute. Understand how difficult this view is. Wait for it. You zoom in and you can just make out the Golden Dome right over there. right? And then if you walk to the corner, as it's going to do in a minute, you can make out the black dome of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so Jewish families would go up to Mount Zion, they would show their children the little bit of the domes that are sticking out from between the trees, and then they would say, now take a hand underneath that. Imagine that you were looking a hand underneath it. As we go and we see the black dome of the Al-Aqsa Mosque right now. Right underneath the golden dome, that would have been the Western Wall. And right underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque as well, you take a hand breath underneath it, that's the Western Wall, they would say to their kids. That was the closest people could get. Not as serious as security, but wow, does that hurt the soul. Outside of Mount Zion, that's where we are right now, this is actually the marker of where the green line would have run. Okay, so Mount Zion is back there. Over there, that's already the walls of the old city. When I tell you it's meters away, I'm not kidding. It would be so easy to walk there, so close but so far at the same time. On the other side of the walls, if we go to the north, we're just in the south, now let's go to the north. That's where I'm standing right now. This is a little bit of an old video from the beginning of COVID, but it should give you a sense of what we're looking at. This is the St. Louis Hospital, and it sits right across the walls of the old city. And let's listen to a past version of myself guide you right now while I take a drink of water.
As the tram goes by, as the light rail train goes by, I want you guys to take a look at the path that it's taking, because that is going to actually show you exactly where the green line, the separating line, went through Jerusalem, specifically here in the area between the old city, which you can't see, that would be Jordanian East Jerusalem, and West Jerusalem, Israeli-controlled Jerusalem, behind me. Good, now you've seen the train, you know exactly where the green line goes, and I want you to focus now on the building behind me.
Focus on that building right now, because one of the stranger stories happened in that building, the St. Louis Hospital, it's run by French nuns. It's considered to be one of the best hospice cares today. Fun fact, it's nothing to do with our topic, but it's run by French nuns, and it's where the ultra-Orthodox tend to send their elderly because they take the best care of elderly people at this hospital. And even one of the wives of one of the great Hasidic rabbis, when they said you need to go into hospice care, she said, I want you to take me to that hospital, because I've seen what people look like when they leave that hospital, and they are taken care of to a T. But in the 1950s, 1956 to be exact, the woman who's there over here, her name is Miriam. She is an Israeli woman. And she wakes up one morning, she looks out her window at that view above what is today the light rail, but back then was the no man's land. She maybe gets a little bit of a glimpse of the Jordanian soldiers on the wall across from her, and then she coughs. She coughs into a handkerchief, and she takes the handkerchief and tosses out of the window into no man's land, which was a garbage dump anyway. Oh, but then she realizes she has a problem. Oh my goodness, what was she thinking? When she threw out the handkerchief, she threw out her false teeth at the same time. She didn't realize she had coughed them out into the handkerchief, and now her dentures, her false teeth, are lying down below in no man's land. And that's how you end up with these incredible pictures. The UN peacekeeper over here, the nuns of the hospital looking in no man's land for the teeth while the Israeli soldier overlooks, and the nun who eventually found them, but again, the Israeli sun actually melted it to the point where some of the teeth fell out. But look at this. This is what the reality was, right? When I say we have three issues, so you have the issue of security, you have the issue of religious freedom, and then you just have the bizarre reality of living in a divided city, where if you lose your teeth, you need to call the United Nations to get them back. But it gets even better. It gets even better. This isn't the only bizarre story. What you're looking at right now is a road called Asael Street. Asael Street sits in the neighborhood of Abu Tor, a little further to the south of Jerusalem from where I just showed you. It's actually right around the corner from where I live these days. And Asael Street was the street where, remember I showed you the smudged lines and I said, look at the homes that are there? So Asael Street had the pleasure of being one of those smudged lines, which meant that everything that happened there was subject to criticism from the Jordanians. It also meant, you want to talk about a crazy reality, there are stories of, you've got Israeli families on one side, Jordanian families / Palestinian families on the other, depending on how they identify at that point in time. These were families that until 1948 were neighbors, right? They had good relationship. And in better times, when bullets from the Jordanian soldiers weren't flying, they would yell at each other, hey, I ran out of pita. Can you help me out? And they would toss it over the barbed wire fence. Or, hey, I got some fresh tomatoes for you. And they would toss it over the fence to each other. But the strangest story, we'll leave this for right now while I tell you this story, and then we'll go on a walk on modern-day Asael Street. The strangest story has to be about the Jewish family, the Israeli family, whose house is underneath one of these smudged lines, and their toilet is an outhouse, and it's located kind of under Jordanian fire. So every time they wake up in the middle of the night and they need to use the restroom, they're running like this to make sure that the Jordanians aren't shooting at them. And at a certain point they say, this is crazy. We want to build a bathroom that's closer to our house. The Israeli government signs off on it, and they warn them. They say the Jordanians are probably going to make some faces. We'll have to deal with it at a certain point. They start digging. The Jordanians start making faces. They go to the UN and they say, hey, the Israelis are doing things without our permission. They're building a bathroom or building a structure without our permission. There was like a bi-weekly meeting between the Israelis and the Jordanians mediated by the UN. There were about 18 hours spent discussing the bathroom, about 36 pages of protocol discussing literally, pardon my language, bullshit, right? Dealing with a bathroom. So that's the reality, that's the crazy reality. I want to take you on this little stroll just so you see how even today, we see how the divide kind of remains on Asael Street. You can see the remnants of Asael Street of 1948 till 1967.
So here, you know what, I'm even going to give you guys a little bit of a bird's eye view. You don't have to look at me the whole time. Got another house with lights indicating a Muslim family celebrating Ramadan. If you look to this house over here to the right, we can see the crescent moons, the very clear symbol of Islam, and actually coming up underneath the bush over here, you're going to be able to see some very interesting graffiti, some very important graffiti as well. This isn't just somebody who came over here and decided to deface a house. This is actually graffiti that's celebrating something. And what gives it away is this graffiti over here. Because this is, does anyone know? I can't actually hear you, but this is the Kaaba. That is the place, the holy site, the holiest site in the world for Muslims. And it is the main pilgrimage site for the Hajj, the pilgrimage that the Muslims must take at least once in their life to Mecca, to Saudi Arabia. And once you take that pilgrimage, when it's traditional, when you come back, you know, they spray paint your house in celebration of having gone on that pilgrimage. Now, how do we know that this isn't, I'm not just taking you through a Muslim neighborhood. Well, it's a little, you have to have some keen eyes to spot the differences in terms of the architecture, and sometimes you can spot it when you're looking at the water heaters and the water tanks on the roof. But just to make it easier on you guys, this is where Mayor Epstein lives, a very clear Jewish name, Jewish family. So we're here on the scene line, and we actually feel, you know, there's something different happening here. There's two different sides to this street.
There's two different sides of the street. You still feel it today. Thank you, Yoni. I need to teach him to talk a little bit less, though. He's a little bit of a chatterbox. But there's two different elements to this street even today. You still feel that there was this impact from 48 till 67. When do things change, right? I keep saying 1967. Things are going to change during the Six-Day War in June of 1967. And the big kind of like the big reasons it's going to change, or there's two important things to understand about the map of 48 till 67 to understand what spurs the battle for Jerusalem in 1967, is you have these two areas in East Jerusalem, right? So this is the old city over here, and you have Armon HaNatziv, literally the Chancellor's house, where the British High Commissioner sat over here. That's in the south, and this area over here is Mount Scopus. They're in circles because from 1948 till 1967, even though the city is divided, they're under partial Israeli control. This is under complete Israeli control. There's a different status to Armon HaNatziv. We won't get into it. But the two of them are enclaves surrounded by the Jordanians. To get to Mount Scopus, by the way, this is the crossing. This is the border crossing from the 1948 till 1967, known as Mandelbaum Gate. Again, a clear indication of this city line is really just meters away. Israeli soldiers and Jordanian soldiers just reaching over the fence to each other at Mandelbaum Crossing. But let's dive into 1967, to the Six-Day War. In May of 1967, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, starts to get busy. Without going into all of the details, just the basics, he begins kicking the peacekeeping, the UN peacekeepers out of the Sinai Peninsula and mobilizing forces into the Sinai. And in addition, what he does is over here, this area known as the Straits of Tiran, a main shipping route, he shuts it off to Israeli shipping, which is a casus belli. It's a cause for war. He's not allowed to do that. Everything indicates that Nasser is going to war with Israel. He's massed the troops, he's made a declaration of his intents with the Straits of Tiran, and that's what's going to eventually lead Israel to very quickly take their jet fighters, fly out to Egypt, and bomb all of the Egyptian Air Force while it sat on the tarmac. By the way, anyone who wants to tell you it was, Israel fired the first shot, Israel was preempting with the strike. We know that because of all the things I told you, and also, when is an entire Air Force located on the tarmac? Only when they're getting ready to attack. Very clear that it was a preemptive strike. War breaks out with Egypt, and war also then breaks out in the north with Syria and Lebanon because of the treaties that they have together. Jordan is not held by those treaties, and Israel looks to Jordan and says, please do us a favor. We don't want to have a fight on the Eastern Front as well. North and South is enough. Just stay out of it and we'll stay out of it with you. But the Jordanians give in to the pressure of the Arab world and also have this thought of maybe we can finish what was started. And they start attacking in Armon HaNatziv, that enclave in the south of Jerusalem. And in addition, very quickly, the Israelis are going to realize we've got a problem because Mount Scopus is manned by about 180 Israeli soldiers. I have to say it quietly because we weren't supposed to have soldiers there. So they're disguised as students and policemen, but Israeli soldiers were holding Mount Scopus for all of those years. But now the war has broken out and Mount Scopus finds itself surrounded by Jordanian soldiers, hostile Jordanian soldiers at war. And so the first thing Israel is going to do, they're going to say, we've got to connect Mount Scopus to the rest of Western Jerusalem. We have to make it from Western Jerusalem to Mount Scopus. There's going to be an incredible battle that I'm going to throw out for your own, for homework, for bonus points afterwards. Look up the Battle of Ammunition Hill. 27 Israeli soldiers killed in this battle on their way to connect Mount Scopus to Western Jerusalem, crossing through a fortified bunker, originally a ammunition bunker by the British, who over the 19 years were able to build it up with incredible trenches. You guys were with me in Ammunition Hill, right? Right, you guys know it. It's an incredible sight. When you come to Israel, I have to take you there. We can't talk about it now, but it was a bloody battle to connect Mount Scopus to the rest of Western Jerusalem. This is Mount Scopus over here, sitting on the range overlooking the old city. When the Israeli soldiers have finally made it to Mount Scopus, that's when all of a sudden Israel says, okay, wait a second. Things have shifted a little bit. And think about all of the traumas and all of the issues that I discussed. the security issue, the lack of access to religious sites, the crazy reality of living in a divided city, a decision is made from on top of Mount Scopus to go and to take the old city. And that sets the stage for Moshe Dayan, who at this point is the defense minister, and Yitzhak Rabin, who is the chief of staff, and Uzi Narkis, the general of the Central Command, who oversees the fighting in Jerusalem. The three of them walk triumphantly into the old city. Jerusalem has been, choose your term, right? Jerusalem has been liberated, conquered, reunited, however you want to refer to it, it changes. I go with reunited. I think that's the most neutral of the terms. Jerusalem has now been reunited after those 19 years of separation, and it's going to take 2 weeks for Israel to decide we are going to apply our law, Israeli law, to East Jerusalem as well because of those traumas. Everything that I mentioned to you, that's all the context for this decision. But they don't just reunite East and West. If we look over here, you have the map. This blue line over here gives us an indication of Western Jerusalem. Western Jerusalem from 48 till 67. The yellow area is the Eastern Jerusalem, the 6 square kilometers of Eastern Jerusalem under Jordanian control. Jerusalem will triple in size. It's not going to become 44 square kilometers. It's going to eventually become it sits at 138. These are the new boundaries of Jerusalem. Israel makes a decision to expand. There's a lot of claims and a lot of reasons for why they expand the boundaries. One is demographics. They wanted to make sure that there would still be a strong Jewish identity and Jewish interests would be able to be protected in the city. So they played with some of the numbers to create some demographic safety. And then there's also a security reason. Security reason because we're still at war with Jordan. Peace is only going to happen about 30 years later. Jordan is a stone's throw away, kind of quite literally. And what Israel does is take strategic locations and include them in the Jerusalem municipality. The clear example is what appears here as Kalandia Airport, also known as the Atarot Airport. So you have a landing strip in northern Jerusalem. They want to include the airport in Jerusalem, make sure that they have that strategic asset. But what they also do by expanding the border is to build 6 new neighborhoods, what are referred to as ring neighborhoods, or if you want, kind of like a buffer neighborhood. All of these neighborhoods are built on land, on high ground, so that in case there's ever a Jordanian attempt to retake Jerusalem, before they get to the center of the city, it's ringed by these topographically advantageous neighborhoods, and artillery can be used to repel the Jordanian tanks. What happens though when they expand? When Jerusalem triples in size, it's not just the area of the city that triples in size, the population is going to grow as well. There's going to be about a 38% increase in the population. Around 60,000 East Jerusalem Arabs are now going to come under Israeli law. And now Israel's got a dilemma. What do we do with them? I'd like to turn that over to you for a minute. Should Israel give them citizenship? The law has been enacted on them. They're under Israeli law. So on the one hand, they deserve citizenship. On the other hand, there's a lot of identity politics. Yeah, I don't know how everyone in East Jerusalem identifies, so I'll give you the different identities. For 19 years, they were living under Jordanian rule. Many of them have Jordanian passports, but they've also begun developing a new identity as Palestinians. That's already something that exists at this point in time. They start identifying as Palestinians or Jordanians, whatever it is. I can tell you one thing. They weren't Zionists. They weren't big fans of this new Zionist Jewish state. And so Israel's going, if we give them citizenship, what happens? And on the flip side, do they even want citizenship? If Israel forces citizenship on it, are they going to take it? Are they going to rebel? So Israel decides, here's what we're going to do. Citizenship is on the table. Anyone who applies can receive citizenship. Anyone who doesn't apply, what do they receive instead? Does anyone know? Anyone study international law? If you're not a citizen, then you're a resident. Permanent residence status. So they're given residency, which, here I've got the Israeli ID card up here with the Palestinian ID card, which is an anachronism, right? This is going to come years later, right? It doesn't exist in 1967, but my point here is that the status is neither this nor that. It's its own unique status in Jerusalem. Now, what does residency get you? If we're being straight about it, it's very similar to what I have as an Israeli citizen. They get Social Security, Israeli healthcare, freedom of movement through all of the state of Israel. What they don't have, they have the ability to run in municipal elections, to vote in municipal elections, excuse me. They can't vote in national elections because they're not citizens, and they don't have a passport because they're not citizens. They can apply for something called a laissez-passer, which is a travel document. It's a little more cumbersome and a bit of a headache, but that option exists as well. So in East Jerusalem, you now have East Jerusalem residents who also have the option throughout the years, if they want, they can apply for citizenship. That's on the table. It's tricky because for a while, for many years, if an East Jerusalem resident would leave their home for 7 years, they could have their residency revoked, as is with residency throughout the world. If you can't prove this is the center of your life, your residency can be revoked. Actually, in 2017, that was changed when the Supreme Court said anyone who's born in East Jerusalem, you need to treat them as if you need to give them a higher residency status. And so there's less revoking of residency status these days. It's a challenging reality, though. They have a lot of the rights, but they're also missing some rights. They don't necessarily want all of the rights. There's a tiny, tiny percentage that actually votes in municipal elections because they don't want to be identified with the Zionist government in any way, with the state of Israel in any way. And it's led to a situation where you feel that seam line. You feel the difference still between East and West. It's very complicated. Right? Look at just the building here in East Jerusalem. Look at how things are built. I once heard a British person say it's higgledy-piggledy. Right? There's no clear zoning. It's not part of the Arab culture is to build in this style, and over those 19 years and even before that, that's how it was built. It's very complicated to zone these areas, both because of what is the world going to say, and are the residents going to accept it, and also future Israeli interests. From the left and from the right, zoning can come under attack. And there's a question mark. There was a question mark for many years that hovered over East Jerusalem. Because what is this? It was kind of in limbo for many years, especially as the world put pressure on Israel, right? And there's always talk about what is the future of Jerusalem. Is it going to be divided? Is it going to be united? And I have to say, as a Jerusalemite, this is where a little bit of my opinion creeps in, but I think it's fairly objective. For many years, East Jerusalem was neglected, because there's that question mark. Some people say that there is a claim that says that it was to encourage the residents to leave. There are people who believe that, but there's also just a giant question mark over the future of the city. So do we invest in this city in this part of the city, if it's going to be given away? And who are we working with? And how do we do this? It changed about 15 years ago when a new mayor came into City Hall in Jerusalem, Mayor Nir Barkat. And Nir Barkat, who is now a member of Knesset and possibly a minister in the new coalition, Nir Barkat looks at the situation and says, well, we got to do something with East Jerusalem. We have to take care of East Jerusalem. And so he starts creating a special unit within the municipality. I met with his senior advisor on Arab affairs a couple of times, who took me around and introduced me to the people who he works with. They created a unit that did bridge building with the residents of East Jerusalem to understand what do you need, and how do we fix things in a way that's not how we think we need to fix things, but how do we fix things in a way that you want us to fix with? And it's a very big challenge. Remember, these are people who, many of them, most of them identify as Palestinians. When you read about the riots, you hear about the riots and the violence in East Jerusalem, it's because there's a clash of national identities. But there was this effort to start addressing East Jerusalem, to address the 600 to 900 classrooms that are missing, to address the lack of sanitary care, the health care that needed to be improved. And what we've seen is a very slow but sure change in the dynamic in East Jerusalem. Because not only did Nir Barkat do this, but in 2018, which I finally get to say, once upon a time my joke was, in 2018, before we entered into this endless cycle of elections, now it looks like the endless cycle of elections has come to an end, but right before we went into all of those elections, one of the last bills that was passed was a 2.1 billion shekel plan and budget to change East Jerusalem, to improve East Jerusalem. 2.1 billion shekels with a comprehensive plan on how we're going to tackle unemployment, how we're going to tackle the poverty rate, how we're going to improve the sanitation and health care in East Jerusalem, passed by not the municipality, but the Israeli government. So it's gone to another level. When I first started talking about this, it was 2018, 2019. Now it's 2022. I was on the plane flying here, and I go, oh my gosh, the time flew because of COVID. It's 2022. This plan is about to end. Where are we? What's happening now? And then I found out that there's a new plan that's being put on the table. Now, we'll see. We'll have a new government and new policies, so who knows, but the plan that was being developed is actually one that's going to double, in theory, the amount of money. 4 billion shekel, right? So that's more than $1 billion American dollars that will be invested in East Jerusalem. The main focus right now is on education and understanding that if we can educate the youth, if we can change the way they learn, they have a future. Because again, you want to understand how complicated this is? There was a period of time where East Jerusalem had 3 different options for curricula in the school. You could study the Jordanian curriculum, you could study the Palestinian curriculum, you could study the Israeli curriculum. Nowadays, it's the Palestinian curriculum is prevalent. But imagine, in East Jerusalem, they're studying from the Palestinian curriculum and doing the Palestinian matriculation exams. And what that means is you have generations of East Jerusalemites who don't speak Hebrew. They never learn Hebrew. They live in Jerusalem under Israeli law, fully annexed in the 1980s, and they can't speak Hebrew. And their matriculation is a foreign matriculation. So even if they somehow get into the Hebrew university, which we've seen a rise to about 15% are going to Hebrew university, even if somehow they get in, I mean, they're limited. And if they go to a university outside of Israel, then they come back and they don't have the skills. They don't have the practical communication skills. They don't have the practical abilities, and they have a foreign diploma that doesn't help them much. So the first move that's been made and was being made in conjunction with a lot of the principals and the leadership very quietly was to incentivize the educational system. And to move it to an Israeli system, there's a lot of people who get up and say, they're trying to Israelify the Palestinians. They're trying to steal their identity. Okay, if you want to go that route, you can, but think about it practically. These people are not losing their identity, right? It's being done hand in hand with the educational leadership. But if you go to the Israeli curriculum, you'll have an Israeli matriculation exam. You'll learn Hebrew. The options all of a sudden multiply in front of them. That's the complicated reality that we have in East Jerusalem right now. Because it was divided for so many years, right? You have like all of these different little things that exist that are not like anywhere else in the country, but that finally, both the municipality and the government have started looking at and saying, there's still a question mark over Jerusalem, over East Jerusalem, but we need to step in. We need to do something. And we're seeing a change in the dynamic in terms of East Jerusalemites as well. Once upon a time, you would see maybe 1 or 2 people applying for citizenship over the years. to the point where the Israeli Ministry of Interior, which, the Israeli Ministry of Interior is called Misrad HaPnim, and all Israelis joke and call it Misrad Al Panim, which translates to, on the face. It's a colloquialism for the terrible ministry. It's like the bureaucratic monster of Israel. Anyone who's got to go in there and get a visa, regular person, right? Even Israelis who have to go in there, it's lines, it's bureaucracy, it's always frustrating. They say the best thing to do is to bring a cake. You bring a cake and you give it to the woman in charge of you, she's going to make sure to be taking care of you, right? You bring the cake and all of a sudden you have like 5 clerks who are on top of you. But that's the situation for Israelis. Now imagine East Jerusalemites, you've got like 2 or 3 people over the years applying for citizenship. The bureaucratic monster is stuck. And it was stuck in the 1980s when no one was applying for years. Again, in 2017, things changed. And the Supreme Court started investigating what was going on, and the Ministry of Interior changed the mechanism and the bureaucracy. It still takes about 5 years for things to be processed, but the process is sped up. And in recent years, you have about, depending on the year, you've had between 1,500 to 3,000 East Jerusalem residents applying for Israeli citizenship, with about half of them getting it. Now, what does the future look like? I don't know. We don't know exactly. There's still that question mark. But we're seeing a movement that I happen to think, and maybe it's my opinion sneaking in my interpretation, it's a positive change. Where it leads to, we can argue, the end game, what it's going to look like, good, bad, but there's a positive change, at least in terms of the sides are in some sort of a dance together. There's some sort of a communication. And if we look at those 3 issues that we started with, we look at the issue of security. Well, today you walk down beautiful Mamilla Boulevard and you see Muslims, Christians, and Jews going to their holy sites, streaming to their holy sites together. You still have the issues of, this city that was once divided. It's clearly complex. There's clearly frustration on both sides. But at the same time, little by little, it looks like we're working through that frustration. And we're overcoming those issues that existed from 1948 till 1967. I think it should be clear to everyone that the reunited Jerusalem, I'm again not saying what the future looks like, but the reality we have in current reunited Jerusalem is one that is just heaven and earth between what existed from 1948 till 1967. So please take that as a little bit of context. The next time you read something about East Jerusalem, I hope it's a little clearer to you. I hope you understand why things at times can seem so frustrating, why when people start making the claims against Israel, we make mistakes, but there's such a large context that people miss, because 1948 till 1967, the reality was really one that was unbearable. And I'll leave you with this. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And I hope that soon we will see a Jerusalem that is calmer, more at peace, where everyone has found a place that they can call home. We're really getting there. I see it on most days. There's only some days where it's interrupted, but still, we pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. Next year, we should all be in Jerusalem. Hopefully, I'll be able to guide you when you come. Thank you.